So welcome everybody. Today I would like to express a very warm welcome to the participants of this stakeholders focus group meeting on limited markets guidance. The meeting this afternoon aims to discuss the reflection paper and the scientific guidelines that were recently published for public consultation. And the consultation will be until 15th of May 2021. And these guidelines will supersede the currently applicable guidelines under EMA's mumps limited market policy as from the 28th of January 2022 onwards. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ivo Klaassen and I'm the head of the Veterinary Medicines Division here at the agency. And it's an honor to open this event with only 10 months to go until the Veterinary Medicinal Products Regulation will become applicable. I'm sure you're all aware of that. Activities to promote the availability of veterinary medicines have been and continue to be a high priority for the European regulatory network. And one of these activities that we report on every year has been the minor use, minor species limited market initiative by the agency, aiming to facilitate the access to the market of products indicated from mumps limited market as part of measures to promote the availability of veterinary medicinal products. And in our annual update, you can see that many products have been benefiting from this mumps scheme over the past years. The new regulation 2019-6 of the European Parliament and the Council on veterinary medicinal products introduces for the first time the legal basis for granting marketing authorizations for limited market products. And it defines conditions and requirements that are consistent with the aim of the agency's policies of promoting availability of veterinary medicinal products for limited markets. In order to be prepared for the implementation of the VMP regulation in January 2022, it will be necessary for applicants to consider the criteria for eligibility of products and accompanying scientific guidelines. And in fact, today's meeting, I think, is a first opportunity to discuss with us the introduction of the legal provisions. So the program is structured around the introduction of the legal provisions in the regulation, including an overview of measures to promote availability, followed by 2 sessions covering published guidance documents and allowing for discussion. So the focus on the first half will be on the reflection paper for classification of a product as intended for limited market and eligibility for authorization, according to Article 23. And in the second part, we will discuss more the technical requirements. Today's meeting is a virtual meeting due to current COVID-19 restrictions, which does allow for a greater global participation. The meeting itself will be recorded. That's why we're in this particular room. It's a nice big room. And there's only the 4 of us sitting here, but connected to you all. And the recording will be published. And I do feel that this meeting is well timed and that it creates a great opportunity to reach out to a wider stakeholder audience and have the discussions. As you all are aware, we're working hard towards the implementation of the new regulation. It's on track, and you will get some update on the status. And I hope that today's program will stimulate a fruitful exchange. And I would like to wish you all a successful focus group meeting with good discussions. And with that, I would like to open the meeting officially and would like to introduce the first speaker, which will be Agnieszka Kasparek from the Commission, who will give us an overview, an introduction of the legal provisions in the regulation, including an overview of the measures to promote availability. So Agnieszka, in your time, when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivo, and good afternoon to everybody. The main question of any virtual meeting, can you hear me okay?
Agnieszka, we can hear you very well, so I assume the rest of the audience can as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So my name is Agnieszka Kasparek, as Ivo just introduced me. Thank you. And I work in the European Commission in the unit responsible for veterinary medicines. And I will give you just a quick update of the or overview of the legal provisions that are in the new regulation 2019-6 on veterinary medicinal products that relate to limited market. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just a few sentences why we have introduced provisions on the limited market. So basically, when we did the impact assessment many years ago, already 10 years ago, it was very clear that that there is a need in the EU to expand the market for veterinary medicinal products beyond the 4 top animal species. Also, there is a need to fill therapeutic gaps on the market for a limited market. So basically what has been until now called minor uses and minor species, MUMS. And also it was recognized that there was a need to have a clear legal definition of limited markets and also to have a legal basis for certain provisions because there was proof, as Ivo already mentioned, that the MUMS policy was working very well at the MUMS policy that was introduced by the European Medicines Agency. And indeed, there was a need to kind of legalize it. Next slide, please. So I will start with the definition. So we have now introduced in the new regulation the definition of limited markets. And it means a market for 2 types of the products. It's either the products for treatment or prevention of diseases that occur infrequently or in limited geographical areas, or it is a product for animal species other than cattle, sheep for meat production, pigs, chicken, dogs, and cats, which are regarded as major species. So any species apart from these listed are regarded therefore as minor species. The next slide, please. Yes, so we have introduced these new provisions in Articles 23 and 24 of the new regulation. And basically it says that the marketing authorization for a limited market product is a derogation from the so-called full dossier, so Article 8 of the regulation. And in these articles, we provided for a derogation from certain comprehensive safety or efficacy documentation in the dossier for a marketing authorization. And once the marketing authorization is granted, there is a prescribed statement in the SPC that this statement is actually written already in the regulation, so it cannot be changed, and it reads marketing authorization granted for a limited market and therefore assessment based on customized requirements for documentation. The next slide, please. These provisions, Article 23 in particular, provides for certain criteria when a marketing authorization for a limited market can be granted, and basically it is for the products that for which the benefit of the availability of this product on the market, that there is a benefit of the availability of this product on the market to the animal or public health, and there is an evidence that the product is intended for a limited market. Next slide, please. The regulation also clarifies that this marketing authorization is valid for a period of 5 years, and then every 5 years it needs to be re-examined on the basis of an updated benefit risk assessment. It also states that the re-examination is limited to demonstrating that the conditions that I just mentioned in the previous slide continue to be fulfilled. And also it is clearly stated that at any time a marketing authorization for an unlimited period of time may be granted, provided that the missing data on safety or efficacy is submitted. But which is what is not stated in the regulation, but can be, read. It means that also a marketing authorization for a limited market can stay like that, forever, but it needs to just be re-examined every 5 years. Next slide, please. So this is the end. So in conclusion, I would say that the new regulation recognized the need for and delivered the legal basis for the reduced data requirements for certain products destined for limited markets. But I would say at the same time, we very well realize that the provisions in the new regulation provide as many answers as they trigger questions, and in particular on the practical application of the new rules. And that's why I'm very happy that the agency did such a good job in drafting the guideline documents that will be discussed today. So thank you, and I wish all of us a very fruitful meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka, for that first introduction. And I think it's very useful, and I particularly appreciate your final remark in that a very few lines in the regulation can lead to a lot of technical documents that are currently out for consultation in order to make the system work. And I think this is where we gradually have the topic for today, which is how to interpret and how to move on from the regulation into a practical framework that will really meet with the objective of increasing the availability of veterinary medicinal products. We have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations, and then we will have 30 minutes to deal with questions and answers. So I would like to move on, and I hope that you can save your questions also for Agnieszka until that time. I would like to move on with the next presentation, which is by David Murphy, who I don't think needs a lengthy introduction here. David is the chair of CVMP, and David, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all to Agnieszka for that presentation and for setting the scene. I too would like to welcome everybody to this meeting. As has already been stated, you'll all be aware from European Medicines Agency or network strategy documents and from various CVMP work plans that the availability of veterinary medicinal products is a priority area of activity for us. And this limited markets provision in the regulation is seen as a potentially significant tool in addressing some of the availability issues that we have or that we face. It will, of course, depend on how the provision is implemented, and that's pretty much what we're talking about this afternoon. Just, I guess, to say from the outset, it is that, this is a focus group meeting. We're here to hear what you as stakeholders sort of make out of these draft documents that have been presented. The draft documents, they represent CVMP's current thinking on how the provision should be applied in terms of approach to eligibility and specific data requirements for this category of product. But as I say, we're here very much with an open mind. We're here to explain the documents, how we sort of our thought processes in elaborating them. We're not here necessarily to defend them. So, it's very important that we hear what you have to say about the approach, and we do very much look forward to fruitful discussions with a view to improving upon these documents where that is possible. So if we could go to the next slide, please. In terms of, I'm here to present on the reflection paper on the classification of a product as intended for limited market and eligibility for authorization according to Article 23. I did participate in the drafting group for this particular document. Other members of the drafting group were Dr. Berner, Dr. Munoz, Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Haslam-Bikstrom, and Mariette Salary, who represented the CNBV. So just to make the point that there were a number of very experienced regulators that partook in the drafting group for this particular document, and I would like to thank all of them for their input and very active contributions to developing up this paper. So for the presentation this afternoon, I'm going to follow the order of the reflection paper itself. So you will all, I'm sure by now, be quite familiar with it. Next page, please. Next slide. So as I said, the limited markets area is a priority. area of activity for the network in terms of promoting product development. You've heard about the MUMS policy that's been in place, the agency policy since 2009 rather. And in the first 10 years of the policy, there have been 272 requests for classification and 22 market authorizations intended for a limited market have been granted through the centralized procedure. Next slide, please. And in terms of the scope of the paper, the reflection paper relates to requests that are made to the CDMP. There has been quite a bit of communication with CMBB in relation to the elaboration of this particular paper, and CMBB are in agreement that the approaches that are outlined in this paper would also apply to relevant products considered for authorization under MRP DCP. So essentially, they accept the approach as presented here. So that's in terms of the scope. I think it's important to say, though, that while there is an understanding that any decision arising from a request that's submitted to the CDMP, that clearly the agency and the CDMP will follow that particular recommendation. But if it relates to a product that ultimately is submitted via non-CAP procedures, so that is submitted to the member states, well then the member states are the responsible authority, and they can, at the end of the day, make their own determination in terms of classification and eligibility. So it's just important to make that point. Next slide, please. You will all be familiar with the legal text itself, and Jessica has covered that in her presentation. Really, the only thing that I want to highlight from this particular slide is the fact that when we're talking about reductions in data requirements for limited market applications, those reductions are limited to safety and efficacy documentation. So the article itself does not make reference to a reduction in quality data, quality requirements, and that then means essentially that in terms of quality, the quality dossier for limited market products, the expectation is that the quality dossier will be Annex 2 compliant. So just to be clear on that, and that is the understanding that the CDMP had in approaching this exercise. Next slide, please. Okay, so there was a huge amount of discussion within the drafting group in terms of how we understand this particular provision, and essentially our understanding of the provision is laid out in the next series of slides, which is titled Basic Principles, and essentially it is agreed that not all products that satisfy criteria to be classified as intended for limited market are automatically eligible for consideration under Article 23. That in addition to the classification as a limited market, there is this requirement to show that the benefit of availability outweighs the fact that certain documentation has not been provided. It is the case that eligibility for consideration under Article 23 is something that needs to be determined and agreed in advance of dossier submission. And where eligibility under Article 23 is accepted, well then it accepts that the data package provided for that in the subsequent application, that there will be deviations from Annex 2 requirements in relation to safety or efficacy. So if we go to the next slide, please. If an application is considered eligible for Article 23, well then there would be no obligation for an applicant to submit an Annex 2 compliant data package. And such an authorization, if granted, would not be considered a conditional authorization. So there would be no expectation that post-marketing authorization conditions would be attached to that authorization in terms of requiring that data gap to be addressed at a subsequent time. And it was or it is considered that for eligibility for Article 23, that if that's accepted, that there would be a clear data gap from Annex 2 requirements. And essentially, when we're talking about a data gap, there was agreement that what we're talking about here is need to know data in terms of either fully characterizing safety or efficacy rather than nice to know data. And that in terms of that particular data gap, it is noted that at a subsequent time point post-authorization, the applicant may choose to address that data gap and have the dossier upgraded to a standard dossier. If an application, if a product satisfies the criteria to be classified as limited market, but is not considered eligible for consideration under Article 23, then an Annex 2 compliant dossier would be a requirement by default. Next slide, please. In terms of addressing limited market indications, it is clear the classification as a limited market may apply either to a product or to a specific indication for a product that carries other non-limited market indications. However, a limited market indication for a product that carries other non-limited market indications could not be considered eligible for authorization in accordance with Article 23. And the basic issue here is that it would not be possible to issue a marketing authorization having two different legal bases. That's Article 8 and Article 23. I won't go into this in any further detail. I do know that Rick has a number of questions around this, and it's something that we can explore later on in a question and answer. Next slide, please. Also, when looking to apply the limited market provision, it was felt useful to go back and consider experience to date in applying MUM's guidance. And essentially, amongst drafting group, what we did was we had an exercise whereby individual members of the drafting group went back and looked at certain products that have been classified as MUMs and for which marketing authorizations have been granted, to look at the safety and efficacy data set provided in respect of those individual products. What we found from that exercise, and again, it was a fairly informal sort of task, but what we found was that for most products classified as MUMs or limited market, for which a positive opinion was issued, these were typically authorized on the basis of adequate characterization of safety and proof of efficacy. So very few would be considered to have a critical data missing, or if I put it another way, if we were to consider what additional data would we require in order to have adequate characterization of safety or proof of efficacy, and there were very few which were considered to have a significant data gap. Accordingly, for most of those products, they can be considered Annex 2 compliant. The other thing that was noted in terms of a number of products that were authorized, classified as limited market and authorized subsequent or on the basis of that classification, is that for certain product types, one could argue that an Annex 2 compliant dossier should be a basic requirement. And here I'm talking principally about antimicrobials and antiparasitics, in the sense that to authorize those, it would seem reasonable that you would be looking for proof of efficacy as distinct from a reasonable expectation of. So that's just a flavor of the sort of experience to date with the MUM's classification. Could we go to the next slide, please? So taking the basic principles as I've outlined them and noting the experience to date with application of MUMs, the CDMP came up with a proposal for applying the Article 23 provision, and it is as outlined in this particular schema here. And essentially there are two questions to be asked. The first one is the product classified as a limited market? If it's not, well then a Article 8 Annex 2 compliant dossier is required. If it is classified as a limited market, well then the second question to be asked is eligibility for Article 23 met. And essentially here we're asking, does the benefit of availability outweigh the risk of absence of certain documentation? If the answer to that is yes, well then you proceed to an Article 23 application, and there it is acknowledged that the dossier will be incomplete in some respects. There will be gaps relative to Annex 2, and those gaps we've attempted to outline them in the data requirements guidelines that you will hear more about in the second session. But if you have a limited market product, a product that's classified as limited market, and it's not considered eligible for Article 23, well then that by default then becomes an Article 8 application, which should also be Annex 2 compliant. And there is a question around what to do with these products. So these are limited market products that are not eligible for Article 23. Noting that indications of products intended for limited markets or that are classified as limited markets, if you have a product that's classified as limited market, well then it is felt that that product should benefit from that classification, even if not considered eligible for Article 23. So it has been suggested that for those types of products, we do need to look at whatever flexibility is within Annex 2 and consider the need for specific data requirement guidance relating to that category of product. So I'm sure this is something that we'll come back to later. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of the first question, how to approach the questions, is the product classified as a limited market? There are two components to the definition. Part B is relatively straightforward. So any species that's not on that species list is by definition a limited market. The first point, though, requires more thought. So if we go through to the next slide, please. And that is, how are we going to define diseases that occur infrequently or in a limited geographical area? And the approach that the drafting group and CVMP came up with basically is that the primary parameter should be an estimate of the potential size of the market, and that's expressed as a percentage of the EU target species population, noting that figure will be influenced by things like the intended target population, whether the product is for a preventative therapy or for treatment itself. It will also depend on the frequency of the disease or condition relevant to the indication, and also the geographical area in which you get a particular disease or condition. And that figure then, that estimate, would be viewed against certain thresholds. So this is sort of new for a classification of limited markets, where we sort of define what the threshold would be. The suggestion is that the threshold for limited market would be for treatments, anything that represents less than 0.5% of the EU species population, where for vaccines we take a different threshold by 5%. And the reason for going with a different or a higher threshold for the vaccines is that the target population here is typically larger than for a product intended to treat disease. It was felt that this would be a further incentive for vaccines, and vaccine use is something that this agency, CVMP, and the network generally would be looking to promote. And it was noted that the majority of MUM's requests for food animal species tend to be for vaccines. So this would also be an incentive for products for food-producing species. However, the guideline is fairly clear that these thresholds are to be regarded as a guide, and final decision will be determined place by place. Next slide, please. The second question then, in terms of determining whether a product is classified as a limited market, the could then be considered eligible for Article 23. And the question here is does the benefit of availability outweigh the risk that certain data will be missing, so the file will be incomplete. So the proposal is, as you see on the screen, that products that would fit into this category would typically be products that would be considered intended to treat a serious or life-threatening disease or condition, or to address an unmet medical need. And for those products, because there is an unmet need, as it were, in those cases, the absence of certain documentation could be accepted. So that's the consideration in terms of benefit of availability outweighing the risk of absence of documentation. Another point just to make in relation to this slide is that where a determination is made that a particular product is eligible for Article 23, well then it should be the case that other products intended for the same or similar indication should also be considered eligible for Article 23. So the fact that something is considered eligible for Article 23 shouldn't necessarily obstruct other products from reaching the market. In terms of, if we go to the next slide, please. The definitions, I don't really want to go into these in too much detail. They're fairly clear in terms of how we're looking to define a serious or life-threatening disease or condition. This takes into account elements relevant to the target animal itself, whether or not the disease or condition is for, to treat a zoonotic condition, so in that sense, be a benefit to humans, public health. And a third element of this is whether or not the condition to be treated has potential to cause significant economic impact. So that's fairly straightforward, I would think, in terms of the definition. If we go to the next slide, please. And on this slide, then, we attempt to define what we mean by unmet medical need. Again, I won't go into the definition in any detail. Is reasonably straightforward, I think. Next slide, please. So that sort of covers the approach as it is in the guideline in terms of determine eligibility for Article 23. So essentially, there's two basic questions. Is the product classified as a limited market? If yes, does the benefit of making that product available on the market outweigh the fact that certain documentation will be missing? If those questions are both answered in the affirmative, well, then the product is considered eligible for Article 23, and then that applicant, the application is submitted and will be assessed. The fact that something is considered eligible for Article 23 does not necessarily mean that the benefit risk assessment is determined in advance. Clearly, there is a process to go through where a determination is made on the basis of benefit risk at the end of the authorization procedure. If subsequent to an assessment, the authorities issue a marketing authorization, that will be valid for a period of 5 years. And there will be a need at the end of that 5-year period, as indicated by Agnieszka, that the applicant will apply for a re-examination. At the 5-year period, the decision to extend the validity of the marketing authorization will be based on a number of considerations, which would include the acceptability of the safety profile. Second point is, does the product continue to satisfy criteria for classification as a limited market? And the third point would be, does it continue to address a need? So is there a specific medical need for continued use of the product? And here, in terms of this third point, one of the points that would need to be considered is whether or not, in the period since the product was first authorized, there were other products authorized for the same purpose on the basis of full applications that essentially address the previous unmet medical need. So as I say, that outlines sort of any decision to extend the validity of the marketing authorization. So that's the approach to applying Article 24. Final slide, please. You'll be pleased to hear, Chair. There are a number of sort of, well, clearly all of what's in this guide reflection paper is open in the sense that it is in draft form, and we do want to hear from stakeholders in the context of this consultation. But there are a number of issues that we can clearly state require further consideration. Those relate to reduced data requirements for limited market products that are not eligible for Article 23. Will the CVMP be elaborating guidance in respect to those? The actual procedure around classification and consideration of eligibility is something that has still to be elaborated, and that's a task that the agency itself will be looking into. And also there is the issue of incentives, in the sense that the incentives that are currently available under the current MOMS policy, what if any of those will continue under Regulation 2019/6. So those are open issues. And with that, Chair, I will finish up, and apologies for running over slightly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I have to apologize for the fact that the delay was largely caused by the problem with the slides at the beginning of your presentation. So apologies on our side. I'm sure that your presentation will give rise to a lot of questions, which we will deal with later. But before we go to the questions, I would like to give the floor to Rick Clayton. Again, I think Rick Clayton hardly needs an introduction. He's been pivotal for maintaining dialogue between the agency, CVMP, and industry stakeholders. What I didn't know about Rick, and I do know that he has been involved in, I think, all veterinary legislations over the past 25 years. What I didn't know that he was an honorary life member of TOPRA. I'm not sure I can ever meet that status or reach that status. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. They only made me an honorary life member to exclude me from being able to apply to be president, by the way. Thank you for the introduction, and also a great big thanks for organising this event. We are very pleased to be here and to have this opportunity. If you can just go straight on to the next slide to save a bit of time. We also would like to iterate the comment I heard earlier that the CVMP has done a good job in getting this reflection paper and the guidelines together. We are aware that the CVMP has a great deal of work to do in covering all the bases for implementing the new regulation, and this is just one of them. The reflection paper is a really useful approach. It's great to have an opportunity for discussion now. I will say, I'll give my excuses now, and this is being recorded, so my excuses will be there for public record. Our presentation has been put together quite rapidly. We received the guidelines for public consultation and issued them. Then we received the invitation for the focus group, but unfortunately our deadline for comment was after the focus group meeting. So we tried to accelerate things and get some early comments in. But it did mean that I was writing the presentation right up to the last minute. So bear with me, please. Now, my presentation is going to be a game of three halves. There are obviously plenty of things in there that we welcome, because the reflection paper does bring some clarity and gives us some indications of the direction the CVMP are going. So that's very, very useful. There are a few things where we would like more clarity. Some of these may just come from a quick first reading, and maybe if we read the reflection paper 2 or 3 times, we might be able to answer these ourselves. So again, please just bear with us. And then I'll attempt to identify what we see as the big challenges facing us here. So let's go on to the next slide, please, where I have a couple of slides on some examples of the things that we're finding very useful, and we're very thankful that are in there. For example, confirmation that the regulatory system will continue to issue marketing authorizations as are currently being authorized under the MUMS policy. That's good to hear. We found the definitions and scope very useful. We found Annex 2 very useful. Clear statement that you cannot have a generic of an Article 23 product. That's very useful. Please just ignore the item in brackets there. That should probably come out. And also there's a useful statement that the market size and extent of use is considered in an EU context and not a national context. That's good to have that clarity as well. Next slide, please. And then a few more examples. The fact that a limited market classification doesn't prevent other similar products being eligible. We do have some questions around that, and those probably relate to when a full Article 8 product comes onto the market and you lose the classification for an Article 23. There's a question of having the rug pulled from under your feet a little bit there, so we do have some questions around that. It's clear that the classification is valid for 5 years and it can be renewable, so that helps answer some of our questions. And products that are already authorized under the current MUMS policy, their authorization will not be affected under Regulation 2019, I believe 6. It's nice to have that confirmation as well. And maybe just relating to that, consequently, we are not expecting those products to require any label changes, any variations or anything. We are thus expecting them just to stay as they are. Next slide, please. So now let's move on to some areas where we are seeking clarity. And some of these are small areas that I think are already resolving in our minds, but let's go through them. And some of them will certainly need more discussion. The first point is we think it would be useful if the reflection paper distinguished more clearly between the current MUMS policy status and the future limited market status products. There is a footnote 3 on page 3, which we felt was in fact incredibly important. So maybe it shouldn't be a footnote. Maybe there should be a separate section covering this. I think it needs a little bit more prominence. Also, we would like a bit of clarity around what guidelines are coming, because we're a little bit confused by some of these statements. If you read the CVMP work plan, it talks about revising and updating the MUMS guidelines. Ivo, in his introduction, mentioned that the new guidelines that will come will actually supersede those guidelines. So that's not totally clear to us. There obviously has to be new guidelines on the data gaps. But the CVMP would also like to continue to some extent with the sort of MUMS policy now for those that qualify as limited markets but do not fulfill the Article 23 criteria. Well, we already have the existing MUMS guidelines which would fulfill that role. So when you say they're going to be superseded, it seems a little bit of a wasted opportunity. So anyway, to cut a long story short, some clarity around that would be very useful. Then the application for limited markets classification and eligibility. We weren't sure whether on first reading, we weren't sure whether those were separate procedures. I have gone back into the reflection paper and I note that you talk about a procedure, so a single procedure, but this is a two-step process, and just clarification around how you see that would be useful. Is it going to be two separate procedures or one procedure with two steps? On your last slide, David, you did mention some issues that still needed to be discussed, and incentives was one of them. That's also a question mark that we have, in particular because the way we see it, every limited market application will probably require some scientific advice. These are all case by case, and there's an element of uncertainty around that. So I can imagine in every case, companies will be seeking clarification and scientific advice. Now, obviously, there's a fee around that. And if companies have to seek scientific advice for a limited market product, that's quite a challenge. There is a question around the benefit risk assessment that has to be submitted. I wasn't able to trace this question back into the reflection paper when I went and had my second look at things. But maybe that's one you can quickly clear up. Is it to be submitted by the applicant or done by an assessor? Was the question. Okay, next slide, please. Now, David, you've already alluded to this slide, but in fact, the original point that I wanted to make here is that in section 4.2, we had the sense that the CVMP was engaging in a little bit of a circular argument. And I listened very carefully to how you talked around this point again just now, and you do use the words experience shows, and the reflection paper used the word experience shows. Well, we see this as a little bit of a circular argument because the mums products have to be Annex 2 compliant. Therefore, the mums guidelines at the moment, they only look around some flexibility in the data requirements, but basically the products are Annex 2 compliant. So then if you write, well, experience shows that mums products can comply with Annex 2, for us that is a circular argument. And I've given there the precise lines that I'm referring to so that you can check this out and see what you think yourself. Now, the reason why I then go in further on this point in the blue box there to look at the numbers is because not to try and say whether this is a success or failure. I don't really know, but to make the point that it is not easy to get a marketing authorization because you still have to comply with Annex 2. So we do hear statements coming that the mums policy has been a success. I heard Agnieszka say that at the opening of this focus group meeting. Well, certainly classification has been a success, and attracting classifications succeeded. We've had 272, as your data shows. And I take on board what you said in relation to this, David, a moment ago. But there is still a challenge around that these products still have to fulfill Annex 2, and therefore it's maybe not surprising that not so many of them actually make that grade. Next slide, please. Now, I think I've got just a couple more on where we're looking for more clarity. So one of the clear statements in the reflection paper is that you will need a separate marketing authorization for an Article 23 indication. We have not had sufficient time to really reflect on that, on whether that's a good or a bad thing. My initial thoughts is there are some pros and some cons. If it's a standalone marketing authorization, which is finally converted into an Article 8 product, well, maybe it can benefit from its own protection of technical documentation at that point, for example. But there are also some downsides that if it's not an extension of an existing product, then the limited market indication cannot benefit from the information from the existing product. You cannot cross-refer to the quality dossier, the safety dossier, it cannot share the packaging, etc. So this has quite some big implications and will lead to extra costs for trying to get a limited market product onto the market. And you can imagine that might be quite a hindrance to the objective there. So we appreciate seeing the legal opinion that's in the reflection paper. We do wonder the strength of that because, in fact, the regulation is silent on this topic, I think. In other words, it neither excludes nor includes the possibility of having a line extension. So we did have some questions around that. On quality, now this relates to the existing MUMS guidelines. Quality is not part of the opportunity for data reductions, but we do have a MUMS guideline on quality requirements, so could they not be applied to Article 23 products as well? There was a question regarding line 260 about the annual estimate that may be refined if the treatment is only medically justified in a subset of animals. So we had some questions around that. I'm not going to go into details. And then we had a question around protection of technical documentation. It's clear that you cannot have a generic of an Article 23 product. That's fine. So the Articles 38, 39, which govern the protection of technical documentation, do not apply. But what happens if the Article 23 product is converted to a full dossier? Does it then become an Article 8 product, if I can call it that? And then at that point in time, would the protection of technical documentation clock start ticking for the 10 years? Because it's a standalone marketing authorization, remember? So it's not part of the global marketing authorization for any original product. So it should qualify for 10 years itself. I'm not totally convinced the middle bullet point at the end there is a sound legal argument, so I haven't covered that. But the basic question remains the same. When it's converted to an Article 8 product, can it then benefit from Articles 38, 39? Next slide, please. And I believe, yes, this is my last slide on where we're seeking more clarity. This slide is perhaps slightly challenging to convey. And again, I listened to you very carefully, David, to what you said, and I feel reasonably reassured. The point here is that on first reading of the reflection paper, certain things jump out at you. And and you can see them in bold there. You can imagine these things jumping out at us. And it raises the question whether these are examples or whether only these things will be eligible. For example, in the first there, the text says these will be eligible if there's a serious or life-threatening disease or will address an unmet medical need. Now, we are taking these as examples and not foregone conclusions that this is the only thing that will be eligible, because that would exceed what's stated in the regulations. So that presumably that cannot be the case. And today, David, your words were products that would fit into this category would typically be things like serious or life-threatening disease or address an unmet medical need. So I think we are hearing what we want to hear there. Then on antimicrobials and anti-parasitics, the text says these product types may be excluded from limited markets. So again, we are reading these as examples and not clear-cut cases that these will automatically be excluded. And that is how we would read the regulation anyway, because the regulation requires a benefit risk assessment. So that must be done, and there may be cases where the benefit risk assessment would be okay for some of these products. We don't know, and we have to keep that opportunity, that option open. In line 313, the reflection paper talks about that these products need adequate characterization of safety and proof of efficacy. Well, proof of efficacy, that is fairly clear to us. It's important for controlling AMR, even if it's a limited market, so there's not actually a great deal of exposure, and that may come into the benefit risk assessment. But it's not so clear why safety would need to be adequately characterized. So there was a question mark around that. The fear is that unless it's clear these are examples, and I think it is reasonably clear, that on first reading there were some alarm bells. Unless it's totally clear, this will put companies off from developing new products in this area and have a negative impact on the R&D into these. And while thinking about all these topics, we are aware, again, that you cannot have a limited market extension to an existing product, so you cannot cross-refer to quality or safety data from an existing product, which again influences the thinking around this. Next slide, please. I'm now in my final section, Chair. I've no idea how I'm doing to time, but anyway,
You are not doing very well, Rick.
Okay, then I shall wrap up very quickly on these. The big challenges we see is this 0.5%, and we've put some thoughts down on there around that. Let's not go through those now because I sense my time has run out. But there are definitely some challenges around that. We don't understand where the figure comes from. We don't want this provision to become devoid of purpose by having hurdles that can't be met. So please, can we have a discussion around that? And next slide, please. Now, the final decision on limited market status will be a case-by-case decision, which is a necessity because of the nature of the game. This offers flexibility, but it also means there's uncertainty. And David, you will know from many discussions with industry that predictability of the R&D plan and the outcome has to be predictable as well. So this is critical. Then the final big challenge we see is coming back to this risk of non-renewal. Things can change. You've invested in your limited market product, but there's no real guarantee apart from that 5-year period of validity that you can continue with this product. An Article 8 product may become available and change the risk balance, etc. So let me stop there. And back to you, Chair. Thank you. And thank you for your patience.
No, thank you very much, Rick, and I do realize that you didn't have a lot of time to look at the paper and get back to us, and then with this focus group meeting. Now, the whole idea of this focus group meeting, which is taking place during the consultation period, is to provide you with clarifications where you feel that is needed. You've taken the opportunity also to find a lot of areas where you really expressed your concern. I wouldn't call it criticism. I think that we're in agreement that we need this guidance document in order to progress. We only have limited time for questions and answers, and I think I do have to apologize from our side because we could have guessed that possibly the presentations would take longer and that a lot of questions may arise. So my proposal in organizing this question and answer session would be that we commit to having all of the questions, obviously, that you've put on here, that they will be answered during the consultation or after the consultation period. And that I would like to give the floor to other participants in this meeting to ask questions for clarification or of a more general nature that have not been addressed in your presentation. And the questions could be either to Agnieszka or to David or other people that we have here that have been working on these documents. Unless there is something burning in your presentation, Rick, that you feel we would need to answer right now. If you can agree.
I prefer to give the opportunity to the attendees, Ivo. If we still have time, I'll maybe raise one from my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I suggest we go for a 10 minutes question and answer session, see where it gets us, and then we take the break as scheduled in order for the second part of this today's meeting to continue. So the floor is open for questions. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And to raise your hand, you have to open the participants pane. And then at the right bottom, you see a little hand. If you push on that hand, it will show on the screen here, and I can give you the floor. I should think we're all proficient in telemeetings. And it appears that you can open, Rick, because I see no one.
Then perhaps the first point of call could be the question around the MUMS guidelines and the new limited markets data gap guidelines. David, is the question sufficiently clear from my presentation?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rick. Crystal clear. There has been a lot of discussion around this within the drafting group and within CBMP also. And as I say, there was a recognition that in terms of the approach that's outlined for eligibility for Article 23, that there would be a certain proportion of products classified as limited markets that would not be considered eligible for Article 23, but that basically they should benefit from the limited markets classification. So the question then is how do we do that? And one of the things that has been suggested, and I would say that CBMP has got to take a final decision on it, but what has been suggested is that we elaborate guidance that will look to exploit the flexibility that's in Annex 2 currently. And that guidance may look very like what you have currently as MUMS guidance. But as I say, it is something that CVMP has got to take a decision on. So in essence, what you could end up with, and again, I'm not making any promises here, but what we could end up with is the data requirements guidance that we're going to discuss in the second session, which would relate to Article 23 applications, and then guidance around the limited markets not eligible for Article 23. So that is something that is actively up for consideration. And again, it's really important to emphasize the point that, you know, our starting objective was to improve the situation, not to make it worse. So in terms of reaching that objective, you know, there does need to be further consideration of the category product that you're talking about. I hope that's clear, Rick.
Yeah.
I guess that was clear, David. I've got a question here by Leticia. The question is to Agnieszka. It's in the Q&A part of the chat that you can use as well. The question is, once the dossier is complete, marketing authorization holder has provided all the data to fill in the gaps. Do we consider that the MA has an unlimited validity but keeps the Article 23 legal basis, or should we consider that the legal basis should be switched to Article 8? And I do know that we have discussed this, but the question is to Agnieszka, so I'll give the floor to Agnieszka first.
Thank you, David. Yes, the question, I understand it is whether, I think Rick also mentioned this, whether the legal basis changes when the additional data is fulfilled, is provided. To be honest, I haven't discussed it. We haven't discussed it with the colleagues from the Commission Legal Service. So I am not sure I can answer definitively to this question. I would feel that probably yes, it would kind of be switched, as Leticia put it, to a full dossier, because if it would stay as an Article 23 legal basis, then I think it would trigger, you know, every five-year validity, which the idea is that once the data are provided, then it kind of transfers into a full marketing authorization. But this is, you know, to be confirmed with the Commission Legal Services. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got two more questions. One, Frédéric Descamps. Frédéric, you have the floor. And after that, Anja Holm.
Goedemiddag, Ivo.
Goedemiddag.
So thank you again really much for organizing this workshop. I do have a question which I think may be addressed, you know, in other presentations this afternoon, but still, I want to take this opportunity to ask this question because, to me, at least, it's not clear at all. The eligibility process speaks about two different steps, and one of those is the question: is the availability of the potential product such that data gaps in safety and/or efficacy are tolerated? How do you think about this? And I'm asking the question to David, maybe. Do you think about the general acceptance of this statement, and it's okay for applicants to proceed with building their dossiers, submit, and rely on benefit risk assessment during the assessment? Or is the expectation that the applicants will need to upfront justify specific gaps in safety and/or efficacy, again, upfront, which by definition is a bit complex and may be redundant with the guidelines, especially the guidelines for immunological products. So any view on this would be appreciated.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think, Frederick, the intention would be that the eligibility piece is determined in advance, and I do agree with you. That's a difficult assessment to do sort of upfront, essentially without seeing the full dossier. But it's a case of the coming back to sort of that critical second question, how to determine the benefit of availability, and trying to establish criteria around that. And in establishing the criteria around that, we've come up with the serious disease, stroke condition, and fulfilling an unmet medical need as examples. But if you have something that clearly sort of fits that those criteria in terms of sort of the benefit of availability, well then it would be accepted as eligible for Article 23. But then within the context of the Article 23 application and the assessment, essentially there is your sort of there's a further benefit risk assessment in the context of that, because you could make an argument in advance that a certain anti-cancer treatment fulfills a particular unmet medical need, but once you see all the data, if that same treatment is not acceptable from a target animal safety perspective, well then the benefit risk assessment at the end of the day may end up being negative, notwithstanding the fact that the original assessment felt that there was a need for that type of product. So it's not a straightforward provision to implement. And in terms of the approach that's outlined, this is how we see that it can be implemented. But clearly, there will be an element of sort of finding our way with it after January 2022. Does that answer your question?
It illustrates the complexity, I would say. Thank you, David.
Okay. If you can come up with an easier way of applying the provision, Frederick, well, then we're all ears.
Yeah, and we have a simple proposal to make, at least from a vaccine standpoint, especially, and you will hear that later. Happy to discuss that proposal later on today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anja, and after Anja, I've got Susanne Sommer who wants to ask a question. Anja Holm.
Thank you very much, Ivo, and thank you also to David and Rick for these clarifications here. My question or input here comes around the same thing, where the implementation of the Article 23 and the definitions in the legislation is very open and basically saying, well, it's the risk benefit, and then you can have gaps. And therefore, when I saw the classification document and also hearing today, I find that this split that is being done between the MUMs and the limited market products, if we can say those, is unnecessary, and it's complicating things unnecessarily much, and it will keep the despite the wish to look at the flexibility in the Annex 2, it will maintain the uncertainty of whether these MUMs but non-Article 23 products, what sort of data they will need to do and not need to do. I'm sure you all remember the endless discussions we had when it came out that even the MUMS products, they could not omit to send in the expert reports, the DAX, for example. So as soon as something is in there, they need to fulfill it. And as Rick said, and I echo that the fact that all the MUMS products are seen to be Annex 2 compliant is a circular argument, because if they weren't, they could not have a legal basis and be authorized. So I think that it would be much better, and I don't know if it's possible, now comes my question, if you could have all the limited market products inside the Article 23. And I understand that there is would be resistance to have, say, all horse products have the opportunity to go via Article 23, but there's no one who stops you in putting 2 levels or several levels in there, so that those that are unmet medical need or serious life-threatening and whatever, they would have a much more flexibility inside the Article 23, whereas the other MUMs will continue with the same type of flexible guidelines that has been in operation for the last decade. And that would save us the split, and it would save us the lack of legal basis for all those many MUMS products that now has to go via full Annex 2 compliancy, but with some flexibility. It's going to be impossible at least for the first 5 years, to predict what will those products need to provide and where are the gaps that could be acceptable. So that's my question. Could they not be put together under Article 23 and then with different levels? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anja. Who would you like to have this question answered?
David. I was David.
Sorry, I see it as a suggestion more than a question. But I may be wrong here. So Anja.
I was thinking about David because he was working with the group, and I'm sure he's aware of all the discussions that had come to this split.
David.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wong, for that question. Again, it is a very interesting approach, and it is, you know, something that will have been considered in terms of the drafting of the approach that we have currently, you know, in terms of putting all sort of limited markets through the Article 23 route. Again, what we're talking about in terms of eligibility for Article 23 is that you know, there would be certain data gaps that are allowable, and in terms of those data gaps, we're talking need to know data as distinct from nice to know. If all Article 23 limited market applications went down the Article 23 route, as it were, then, you know, essentially, based on the experience that we have with the application of bombs currently, you would sort of end up in a situation where effectively you would, you know, the essentially manufacturing data gaps, you know, that then would have to be fulfilled subsequently or addressed subsequent to the issuing of the marketing authorization. So you know, it's a case of and everything that will go through the Article 23 route, you know, would end up in a statement on it that this is, you know, authorizing the absence of a comprehensive safety and efficacy file. You know, when we know, based on the experience that we've had with mums, that there are quite a number of those products where you would be looking for or need, you know, adequate characterization of safety and proof of efficacy in order to allow those out, and in order to authorize those. So, you know, it was an option that was considered, but it was an option that sort of is not without its own issues or problems. So, yeah, just to make that point. Again, you know, it is an approach that we're, you know, can consider or look to again. But it's not that in itself is not necessarily a straightforward approach either. I hope I'm. Yeah, I hope I've gone some way towards addressing it, Anja. But as I say, it is something that we can look to again.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Susanne Sommer, I've got Rick and Elsa still after that, so I'd like to give the floor to Elsa after Susanne. And then I still suggest that we can have a small break for people before we start the next session. So I would like to finish this session in, let's say, at 1:05 half the hour, so in another 8 minutes. Susanne, you go first. Elsa.
Yes, hello, Ivo. Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a very short point for clarification, and I guess this is for Agnieszka, since I think we all realize from David's presentation and Rick's presentation that there are many fronts open for legal clarification. So as for many other areas in the new legislation where we know that the Commission is publishing or will release question and answers or clarification documents, is this something that you could foresee, Agnieszka, or something you can plan? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Elsa. it is not something that we are currently actively planning, but we do not exclude this. However, now, as you know, we are working on the implementing the delegated acts that have a legal deadline very soon. And the agency is working in parallel on a number of different guidelines on this limited market, but also, as you know, the agency is also working on other guidelines. So I think once we have all the implementing the delegated acts adopted and published, that need to be ready for the date of the application of the new regulation. And once we have the guidelines of the agency, and if after that we still have a need, if there is still a need to have clarifications in some kind of Q&A document, then of course we can consider it. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you for that. And obviously the agency is also working on questions and answers for the different topics related to the regulation. So very likely it will be on our website, except for those queries that are a clear legal question where we are not in the position to elaborate on that. I'm going to try again, Susanna Sommer. The question is, will the term mumps disappear from the future guidance? And I think the answer to that is yes, because there will be no legal basis for mumps anymore. So that's the short answer to it. Susanna, would you like to comment on that? I've got a Susanna here as well.
Thank you for this question. Yes, the abbreviation mumps will disappear because this is in principle related to the current EMA policy, and the legislation uses the terminology of limited markets applications and is not referring to minor species, minor use anymore. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And with that remark, I think I would also like to briefly reply to one of the points raised by Rick in his presentation, which is about the incentives, the financial incentives, the fee incentives, and the fees for limited markets. The current system of financial incentives for mumps is largely funded by the agency, and it was a decision by the management board because it was not included in the fee system. Now, a total revision of the fee system is taking place currently by the Commission. Obviously, limited markets will be included there, and what sort of incentives will be included in the new system is not known. So I think we'll have to wait and see the outcome of the discussion on the new fees. The new fees will have to be aligned with the new regulation, and there will be a transition period because it will not be active at the same time. Then obviously there's always for the EMA management board the possibility to agree with certain financial incentives if they want to stimulate availability of veterinary medicinal products, as they are doing for products on the human side as well. So we cannot provide a clear answer on that one. I think I would like to give the floor to Rick for the last question, and then I would like to close this session. Rick, please.
Thank you, Chair. In fact, I wanted to come back to a point that Anya made. It's an interesting point, and I should say at this moment in time, Animal Health Europe does not have a position around this, but I can say that the first comments coming into me appeared to be rather positive about the fact that CVMP was considering keeping the mums policy products going, albeit under a different name. I do recognise Anya's point that there is a level of complexity there and unpredictability, uncertainty, but we don't want to take a retrograde step. So we don't want to lose the current benefits that apply to mums products that then may not qualify in the future as a limited market product. So although it adds a level of complexity and uncertainty, I think there is already uncertainty, and I'm not sure it adds much more. And we don't want to close the door on anything that we have now. I think that would be the sort of position we would take on that. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for that, Rick. And I see that Jacques Lechenet has also put in the question and answers, not a question, but a reaction. MUMS was used with no legal basis, and using only limited markets will be limitations due to the regulation, and the aim was to ease. So I think you will find your colleagues on your side. With that, I would like to close this session. I think it was some good discussion and good to collect the different views from industry as well. And I suggest that we will have a short break. The chair for the next session will be David. So David, what do you suggest to reconvene at 3:45? Would that be timely enough to deal with the last session?
Thank you, Ivo. 3:45. Yeah, it's only 8 minutes away now. So if we reconvene it at 3:45, and then we will see how we get on. We will likely be under pressure to get through the presentations that are prior to them. But we will start promptly at 3:45 and see how we get on. Thank you, Ivo.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it to you then, David, to organize. I'll be away for an hour or so and then be back for the final session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we will reconvene at 3:45. Okay, welcome back, everybody. It is just gone 15:45. So we will get started with the second session for this afternoon. So in this session, we're going to cover the specific data requirements guidelines themselves in a series of 3 presentations, and then they will be followed from the regulator side, and then they will be followed by 2 presentations representing an industry viewpoint in terms of those guidance documents. So the first, we're going to go through each of these presentations one after the other. They're 10-minute slots. I would suggest that we save questions for the Q&A at the end, given that we are slightly behind time. So first up is Dr. Munoz, who is going to present on the guideline on efficacy and target animal safety data requirements for non-immunological VMPs. Dr. Munoz is someone who will be familiar to you all. She is a Spanish CVMP member. She also is the chair of the Efficacy Working Party. So, Dr. Munoz, I shall hand over to you.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. The first thing that I would like to present this afternoon is the structure of the guideline. And in this guideline, there are 8 different sections. Section 1 to 4 is more or less the same. It's a common part in the different guidelines because it's more administrative than technical part. While then we have specific points, and in this guideline are Section 5, which is we highlight the requirements in relation with the preclinical studies, and Section 6, which is referring to clinical trials. Next slide, please. Well, I would like to make clear which is the scope of the guideline, because in this guideline, only the marketing authorization application intended for limited market, but that are eligible for consideration under Article 23 are included. So now we are talking about VMPs other than biologicals and biologicals VMP other than immunological. But nevertheless, and according to the Annex 2, a novel therapy VMP could also fall into this category of the BMPs other than biological and biological other than immunological. So the current guideline, this guideline also applies to this specific case. Which is the aim of the guideline? Well, the main objective of this guideline is indicate which data requirements can be reduced for this type of application in relation with the two part preclinical studies and clinical trial. But nevertheless, it's recognized that it is simply not possible to address all the scenarios in a general document. So in general, the requirements will depend on the product, the active substance, mode of action, but will depend of the availability of information as well. So the applicants are reminded that scientific advice process is available and it's very important to confirm precise requirements for a specific application. And I would like to remark as well that the concept included in this guideline is different than the concept included in the previous MUNS guidelines. As we have commented in the previous section, MUNS guideline identify flexibility in relation with the data requirements, or more precise flexibility in how to provide the data. But at the end of the day, the data to support safety and efficacy always is provided in relation with MUNS product. While here, the clear gap should be identified at the end of the assessment process. So this guideline has been developed to address what gaps in critical or pivotal data can be affected for this type of product under Article 23. Next, please. Well, in relation with preclinical requirements, now I've taken into account the new Annex 2. In preclinical requirements, we already have included pharmacological activity, pharmacokinetic properties, those dosing interval resistant, and target animal tolerant of the product. Well, in general, data to support the different points should be provided, but nevertheless, there is in general the possibility for the interspecies extrapolation of this preclinical data or provide data from the published literature concerning the active substance or the intended indication, intended target species, etc. So there is other means to support the different endpoints if scientifically justified. Next slide, please. Specifically in relation with the pharmacological part, basically the mode of action and the pharmacological effects, together with basic pharmacokinetic data on the active substance, should be provided. But when those confirmation or clinical trial is provided, specific PK/PD data with the product can be omitted. Next, please. And in relation with the development of resistance, only what relevant, but information on the potential emergency of resistance should be provided, or information to support the development of tolerance to the active substance leading to a reduction in efficacy for the claimed indication. Next, please. Those justification and those confirmation studies should be provide almost appropriate data to support the proposed dose, the dosing interval, or duration of treatment and any retreatment interval. So this data can be provided in a classical dose confirmation, dose justification, dose confirmation studies in an appropriate and relevant disease model or in naturally diseased animals. However, for disease condition for which an appropriate disease model doesn't exist, data relating to exploratory or pilot studies in the target animal should be provided. This data can be either proprietary data or from the published literature. Next, please. In relation with the target animal safety, in principle, the tolerance of the target species should be characterized by a classical task study that should be implemented under well-controlled laboratory conditions in line with the principles included in the BHCH guideline 43. However, if we have other means to support the target animal safety, as for instance data from exploratory and or clinical studies, referring to use this substance in another relevant species in the same condition that the product, data from toxicity studies in laboratory animals together with literature report or pharmacovigilance data. Next, please. In this specific case, the absence of a BHCH compliant task study may be affected. Next, please. Well, and finally, in relation with clinical trials, we have to take into account that I think that this is a very different point than the previous situation with moon situation, because now we can accept that for product eligible for authorization under this Article 23, that it's possible to conclude, taking into account the data from the preclinical studies, that the product is safe for the target population when administered at the recommended treatment dose and by the proposed route of administration. And the product is expected to be effective for the proposed indication in the target disease animals. Next, please. In this specific case, the provision of comprehensive clinical documentation included confirmatory clinical trial data will not be required. Next, please. So, in relation with the clinical trial or clinical efficacy, in this case, it's possible to provide data from exploratory pilot studies, from preclinical studies, such as dose determination or dose confirmation studies. And it's possible to provide data stemming from clinical trials conducted outside of the Union and relevant information for the published literature. In general, the idea, the key point is that the data provided should be adequate to allow a reasonable conclusion to be made on the target animal safety and the expected efficacy of the BMP. Next, please. In relation with the summary of product characteristics and taking into account the new regulation, is necessary that in this summary of product characteristics, clearly state that only a limited assessment of safety or efficacy has been conducted due to the lack of comprehensive safety or efficacy data. In regards to that, it will be included that marketing authorization granted for a limited market and therefore assessment basis on customized requirements for documentation. Next, please. In summary, I would like to highlight that this situation is different than the previous one from the application for moons, because here a clear data gap should be identifiable at the end of the assessment process. And the idea is that the provision of a comprehensive task study will not be required when it is possible supported by other means. And the absence of confirmatory clinical trial data will be affected. Those will be reflected in the summary of product characteristics, including a reference that only a limited assessment or safety or efficacy has been conducted to the lack of a specific or comprehensive safety or efficacy data. Next, please. Thank you so much for listening and waiting for your question later. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Christina, for that overview of the Efficacy Target Animal Safety Guideline. So we'll move directly, we'll take us questions on that in the Q&A session at the end. As I say, we will move directly on to the next presentation, which is relates to the Data Requirements Guideline for safety and residue testing of the pharmaceutical products. And here to present this, the overview of this guidance document is Dr. Stefan Scheid. Dr. Scheid is an employee of the BBL, the National Competence Authority in Berlin, and he is a long-standing member of the CBP Safety Working Party and is its current chair. Stefan chaired the drafting group that were responsible for generating this guidance document. So, Dr. Scheid, in your own time, please.
Good afternoon, David and guests. Can you hear me?
Can hear you very well.
So good. So it's a pleasure to present the guideline on safety and residue data requirements for non-immunological veterinary medicinal products intended for limited market. It is the result of the work of a small working group, as all the guidelines that are presented today. And we started with examining the previous MUMS guideline, and it was quickly recognized that the previous MUMS guideline was for marketing authorizations and for MRLs. And we decided that this guideline needs to be split because especially the definition of Salmonidae is different in the two areas. Salmonidae is a major species for MRLs and a limited market species for the marketing authorizations for limited markets. So this was one of the reasons. And there were some other reasons. And so there are two guidelines out of the previous MUMS guidelines, and I'm presenting today the guideline on the limited market, and it applies to the pharmaceutical veterinary medicinal products and to the biological veterinary medicinal products other than immunologicals. So, and the new limited market guideline will address the toxicity, safety, inherent toxicity of the veterinary medicinal product in target species, the consumer safety, the user safety, and the environmental safety. So these are various. As you have here today, applicants are not required to provide comprehensive data for the limited market products, and especially the data must not be fully Annex II compliant. So, but in the area of safety, the absence of pivotal data may mean that an unknown or uninvestigated safety risk needs to be considered in the overall risk estimate, which makes the assessment a bit complicated. So, and based on this, the guideline presents options to deal with the unknown risks arising from missing data and offers also options to reduce and substitute pivotal data. And these include default approaches and surrogate approaches. I come soon back to what this means. So when examining the Annex II, we soon recognized that all studies are relevant in the Annex II. There is no study which is redundant or a priori dispensable. The decision here on what is the critical or less critical data, I would say the must, the should, and the could data, is determined by the product type, the conditions of use, the inherent hazard of the active ingredients and its excipients, and the exposure scenarios. This means, in principle, that in the area of safety, data requirement may change with each veterinary medicinal product, and the guideline recommendations are therefore necessarily general. So the guideline, you cannot expect from the guideline that you have a prescriptive direction as to whether or not you need a certain type of data or not, because this may change with every application. So, and another aspect which needs to be considered, so human safety risk cannot directly be weighted or balanced against the benefit for the treated animal, for instance, consumer safety. And this is one of the obstacles that we encountered when drafting the guideline. And so it's not possible to make compromise on the side of human safety. So we have a default approach. The omission of pivotal data is acceptable if the risk in question is acceptable even for the worst case. So we can leave, you can omit a study when the risk in question is acceptable, and we would accept the worst case and still have a product. If not, then more knowledge is needed to refine the risk assessment. And the options that are offered in the guideline to refine or improve the prediction of the risk in question is, we offer in the guideline so-called surrogate data, which means surrogate means not fully Annex 2 compliant. Annex 2 compliant studies are often animal studies, classical animal studies. But the surrogate data would also include read-across techniques, alternative tests in vivo, in silico, modeling. All this together would help to improve the situation when you don't have, when you cannot accept a worst case estimate and want to refine the risk estimate. So, and resulting extra uncertainties would be factored in the risk estimate. So this is an approach that is between a full data set according to Annex 2 and omission of the data. The next slide. So if the risk is still unacceptable after considering all these options and still unmitigatable, the standard data would be needed. So this is in general, the decision tree that you might need to follow, that you might wish to follow. And one of the principles of the guideline, which is mentioned in several places in the guideline, is that scientific advice will strongly be encouraged, and that scientific advice is strongly advised before compiling a dossier, especially when you're working with all these surrogate data and default approaches. It's always good to seek scientific advice. So the safety documentation, I come to the safety documentation here. The safety documentation basically addresses the toxicological effect in the target animal, the user safety. And the consumer safety has already been assessed in the MAL procedure. So it's not dealing about the toxicological evaluation or the risk assessment for the hazard assessment for the consumer. And because these different needs, data, there are different data needs, and this can lead to different documentation that is required to address these different data needs. So it might be necessary to have certain data to address user safety, but not the same data at the same time to address the toxicological effect in target animal and vice versa. So this makes it a little bit difficult because the Annex 2 is used to satisfy all these requirements. So, and the guideline outlines the principles, the options, and the tools to deal with these incomplete data, as I have said, and the resulting uncertainties need to be considered in the risk estimate and the mitigation measures needed. So I'm coming to the residues and the withdrawal times. So all the guideline also offers options to derive a withdrawal time on non-Annex 2 or non-VRCH 48 compliant studies. So we still have this generic type extrapolation of existing withdrawal times, but you need to own the data or need to have access to the data in this case. So it's clearly stated in the guideline that you can only extrapolate from one product to the other if the data that you're using is not protected. And you have all types of limited bridging pharmacokinetic and residue data that you can combine, and you can use this also in vitro methods, all this. But there's not, as for the safety, there is not a prescriptive decision scheme But it's up to the applicant to compile the data, and also here it is advisable to seek scientific advice. And also here the uncertainties may need to increase safety spans. So, and the guideline offers here some flexibility to choose or combine approaches, and it's more or less what has been in the previous MOMS guideline, except for the focus on the data protection, there's emphasis on the data protection here in this guideline, which was not explicitly in the previous MOMS guideline. So the next slide, please. So I come to the ERA. So the part of the discussion was all of the requirements for the environmental risk assessment, and the outcome of this discussion was there is no specific data reduction. The environmental risk assessment can only be waived if there's already an assessed environmental risk assessment belonging to the same applicant, or if access rights have been granted for a major species. So any identified risk mitigation measures have to be considered for the limited market application, and aquatic species cannot benefit really from this guideline because there is no major species to which they can refer to, or because all aquatic species are now limited markets now. So this is the outcome of the discussion on the ERA. And I have Silke Hickman, who here, she's on the line. So if you want to have answers to specific questions concerning the ERA, she would like to assist. She would be ready to assist me. So the next slide, please. So this is the last slide. Thank you for listening, and any questions? Thank you.
Okay, and thank you very much, Stefan, for a very clear summary and overview of the safety and residues guideline. Again, we will look to take questions at the end, and we will proceed directly to the next speaker. And the next guideline that we're going to deal with is the guideline and data requirements for immunological veterinary medicinal products. And the speaker, the presenter for this item is Dr. Werner. And again, Dr. Werner will be someone who is well known to you all. Dr. Werner works at the Paul-Ehrlich Institute in Germany. She is currently the German CDNP member and is a long-standing member of Immunological's Working Party and its current chair. So, Dr. Werner, I'll hand over to you, and just for yourself and the remaining speakers, just to note that we've had some slippage in time again, so just to note that as you're proceeding through your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Then I will start. Welcome to all of you, and as David already mentioned, I will speak about the immunological veterinary medicinal products. The next slide, please. We can skip this. Here's only the legal background, and the basis was also the Annex 2 that was available at the time when this guideline was prepared. Also here, very short, the structure of the guideline already presented by Christina, and I will focus on point 5 and the last point, the table. In general, we have to say that the requirements of Annex 2, the European Pharmacopoeia, and also other CVMP guidelines concerning immunological veterinary medicinal products apply to all these products, including those for limited markets. However, possible reductions in the requirements are listed in the table 1. You see here that we have chosen the same format as we have for the current MAMS guideline, that we have this reductions presented in a kind of a table. We have also 2 points regarding the immunologicals not containing a GMO, a genetic modified organism, where data generated for other immunologicals containing the same active ingredients and or adjuvants can be used. And there's also a short notice regarding immunologicals containing a genetic modified organism, where it's mentioned at this time that this guideline is only applicable for efficacy requirements. As for safety requirements, the Directive 2001/18 is also applicable, and normally that means that a full safety data set needs to be submitted. But that can be further discussed in the ongoing process. The next slide, please. Yes, what are some general considerations regarding possible reductions in requirements that can be applied? That at first is regarding the laboratory trials that GLP requirements can be lifted. However, the protocols and the reports should allow a satisfactory assessment. I think you know from the Annex 2 that these GLP requirements are not requested also for full applications for all safety studies. There are some exemptions already mentioned in the Annex 2, but at least for the classical laboratory trials, the GLP requirements are requested for a full marketing authorization dossier. The second point is regarding the use of literature to support safety and efficacy warnings and indications. Data generated using the product data can be used, but they should originate from acknowledged scientific literature. Regarding field trials, I think you are now, it's a long-lasting discussion we have in general for immunologicals. It's mentioned that when sufficient data from the laboratory studies, the efficacy laboratory studies, not provided, then they are necessary. However, also here, it's possible to deviate from the GCP requirements. The last point is regarding how to show the benefit of the treatment, and that's mentioned that the treatment differences between the vaccinated and the control animals using appropriate statistical methodology should be shown. And it's also mentioned that practical limitation of data collection for limited market product will be taken into consideration during the assessment. The next slide. Now we are coming to the table where the reduced data requirements are mentioned. You can see here how this table is built up. The next slide. Here we have the possible reductions for the safety tests. The first one is regarding the inactivated immunologicals, where the use of standard batches in the safety studies will be allowed, and that also safety and efficacy studies can be combined in the same laboratory study. We know that from the past that's possible in the field studies. For the live immunologicals, here the use of the least attenuated passage level will not be required. However, the titer that is used should be adequately justified. I think there will be some data in the quality part that can be taken as a basis. Regarding the overdose study, here it was agreed that for live immunological, where this study is normally required, it will not be required for these products. Regarding the repeated dose, there the safety of the primary vaccination schedule should be demonstrated. It's not necessary to include also the first revaccination. Regarding the reproduction performance and immunological functions, also these studies may be omitted, and relevant warning or information will be included in the SPC. Regarding the special requirements that we have for live immunologicals, here you can see the spread of the vaccine strain. Their published literature may be used. If this is not available, then the spread to unvaccinated target animals and to potentially non-target species should be shown. And with non-target species, that's especially for highly susceptible target species. Then regarding the dissemination, this data are not required unless the vaccine strain is shown to spread. Also here, published literature may be used, and it's required for zoonotic diseases, and the persistence of the organism at the injection site should be considered. Field studies for testing the safety are not required if the absence of a significant risk has been shown in the laboratory studies, and it should be explained or reasoned why the laboratory studies are representative. The last slide is regarding the efficacy test. Here also the first one is regarding the different immunologicals, also here for inactivated immunologicals, standard batches can be used, and safety and efficacy study may be combined in the same laboratory study as already mentioned. You know, normally for safety the maximum content should be used, and for the efficacy minimum batches should be used. For live immunologicals, here also they can be combined in the one-dose laboratory with the one-dose laboratory safety studies. The use of the maximum passage level is not required, and also the titer should be justified why it was used here. For immunosera in immunological action should be demonstrated, and regarding the duration of immunity and also the effect of maternally derived antibodies, omissions are acceptable, and that should be stated in the SPC. Regarding field studies, they are not required if the efficacy is shown in laboratory studies. It should be reasoned why the laboratory studies are representative. However, also we have the possibility that field efficacy studies may replace laboratory efficacy studies if that fits better. I think that was the last slide. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Berner, for again a very clear overview of the data requirements guidance on immunologicals. So we will move directly on to the presentations from industry in relation to their reflections on what they see in these guidance documents. The first one that we will deal with is a response from Dr. De Camp in relation to the industry view on the immunologicals guideline. So Frederick De Camp is, well, since 2001 has been with Pfizer Animal Health, now Zoetis. Frederick is Director of Regulatory Affairs, Biologicals in Zoetis, and Vice Chair of the Animal Health Europe Biological Working Party. In a previous life, Frederick worked at the Belgian Medicines Agency, the regulatory authority there, and was an alternate CBMP member. So, Frederick, in your own time, please.
Yes, thank you, David. Thanks again from my side and on behalf also of the industry to organize this meeting. Again, really appreciate it. So this presentation will in fact not only focus on the guideline on immunological itself, but also on the eligibility process. We have reasons for that. And recognizing that a number of comments and questions were already addressed, I will adjust the presentation accordingly. So this slide, just to reiterate what has been said, especially it's a reality that mum's MA dossier for immunologicals, and I have faced one very example, we can say that they were ultimately very close to full MA dossiers. So just to reiterate that. So limited market, in my opinion, is a real opportunity for change. It's important that it could be seen as a way to reduce the gaps in the requirements that regular vaccines need to meet versus autogenous vaccines. However, as already discussed, the process is quite uncertain and requires multiple steps. So I think we welcome the revised guideline on immunologicals. We think it raises some important challenges that we discuss. And just to reiterate also that vet vaccine availability remains a critical topic not only for the authorities, but also for industry. And also we reiterate that we like predictability of outcomes. Next slide, please. So why do we like predictability of outcomes? We make decisions early in the process, so typically 3-5 years before we actually come to MA submission. We also work with a closed envelope, so there is a prioritization process typically. I will not enter into details, but just for the audience to understand that, when we choose for something, it means that we do not choose for another thing. And working with infectious diseases typically, worth to reiterate that epidemiology by definition evolves over time. And so we hope that there will be flexibility in authorities' views whenever we face a situation where we apply for limited market, and then there is a slight change in epidemiology and in the market 5 years after that, and that will not lead to a complete switch in opinion. Just to reiterate or to iterate that vet vaccine industry in Europe works more and more towards developing multivalent vaccine. It's true for fish, but it's true also for other species. So that's an area that may further benefit discussion in the guideline. We appreciate the opportunity, but not the obligation to develop a limited market MA into a full MA, that's for sure. Next slide, please. So coming back to the question I raised earlier today, it seems to be a stepwise and uncertain process. I will not enter into the details again. I hope it's clear that the need to develop a vaccine or a product that treats a serious disease or address an unmet medical need is just an example, and that we will need to absolutely fit within that category. That was discussed already. I raised the question about the next bullet point. Is there an expectation that applicants will need to address safety and efficacy gaps upfront? And if so, how difficult can it be? So once applicants have gone through this process, then you are supposed to enter into the guideline itself. And it's quite a concern for us that the guideline, also explicitly not intended to refer to procedural guidance, it still refers to a scientific advice as a by default or as a possible option. And we would like this to make clear that we are not expected to go for scientific advice, especially for regular vaccines. Next slide, please. So this is a bit the process in general that we would like the authorities to contemplate. Question one, do you develop an immunological or a vaccine for limited market? If yes, then we would hope that we would quite straightforward go to the guideline itself, as opposed to a stepwise process with each time uncertainties around that. And I would add, at least for vaccines, and certainly for those addressing an unmet need. This is not unlike the previous or the original MUMS guideline, where we had a list of diseases for which it was clear from scratch that if a company would develop a vaccine against one of those diseases, it would fit automatically into the MUMS concept. And importantly, we believe that this straightforward process is still essentially in line with the EC regulation. And there is some additional explanation in the next slide. So we believe and we consider that IVMPs, and again, especially vaccines, are a well-known category of vet medicinal products. We understand very well the potential risk when we start developing those products. It's of course much less so for novel therapies. We believe also that the revised guideline on immunological product is addressing the key risks in a meaningful way. It still requires, for example, reversion to virulence to be done. It still requires target animal safety to be conducted, etc., etc. So these elements, together with the fact that we would be required to provide benefit-risk balance at the end, plus also the fact that there will be mentions in the SPC that this is a limited market product, I think we start to believe that it should be enough to switch smoothly from limited market to the application of the guidance itself. In terms of the guidelines itself, just as a general comment, we would like that it is applied quite smoothly, and that assessors, if possible, do not require extensive technical justification to justify omission of data. For example, the guideline is saying MDA interference study can be accepted, provided it's justified. We would like that the guideline is saying MDA interference study can be accepted, point. Again, as said before, we would like to make clear that there is no, by default, scientific advice request expectation. And again, that's something that has not been said today. Scientific advice is representing fees, but also a lot of work from companies and also for the authorities, obviously. But it also doesn't always deliver clear answers. And so I think that this needs to be considered as well. And of course, recognizing that companies need to do a good job and asking clear questions and proposals. You can go to the next slide, please. So I think I will be quick on this. Predictability is key. I think that we were quite wrong in saying that the sentence on the screen would be acknowledged in the SPC of limited market. I think it's a copy-paste mistake. It's another sentence that should have been copy-paste. Just to reiterate that we acknowledge the addition of a sentence. However, we would prefer that, and we would strongly suggest that data gaps are rather reflected in the EPAR rather than in the SPC. And we see, for example, that the guideline on immunological mentions on several occasions the need to add warnings. And so just to say, if there is a need to reflect data gaps in the SPC, then we would strongly recommend that this is done in a neutral way, as opposed to warnings, so to speak. The last bullet point was already addressed, so we can go to the next slide. So vaccine and immunological products availability is quite key. A couple of comments in that regard. We already started to discuss the fact that it's unfortunate that there is no option for reduced quality in limited market because of the interpretation of the regulation. We would still make clear that, or we would still suggest that the authorities make clear that companies can use relevant data as opposed to specific studies. Also because the current Annex 2 also allows to use related data for a category of products like fallout from multivalent vaccines, but also on preservative efficacy, etc. So we would appreciate that this is reflected in the guideline as well. We certainly welcome the option to apply the guidance for multivalent vaccines, so not only for monovalent vaccines. And maybe that's an area where the guidance can be more developed. In our mind, and I think it is also in the minds of the authorities, the guideline on limited market should be compatible with vaccine antigen master file and platform technology master file. And likewise, we would like that it doesn't preclude its use for emerging disease vaccines, because it just provides another opportunity in addition or in complement to the exceptional circumstances guidance for companies to develop vaccines against emerging disease organisms. That's actually an incentive for investment in peacetime when by definition the market is limited or completely absent. Next slide, please. P incentive is welcome. We discussed that already. Just to reiterate the mention on fish vaccines, where at least for every product that contains a new antigen, there will be a requirement for those products to go centrally. And so for those products, a fee incentive for CPMA would be welcome, I guess. Also for fish vaccines, it was quite the rule for companies to go and discuss MUMS guidance with national authorities, the few national authorities that handle fish vaccines up to now. We would like that this is maintained, and we realize that this may be outside of this discussion. We can go to the next slide, please. And there are the specific comments on the guideline itself, and that's actually a collection of the previous comments. Quality data, MDA interference, we suggest that the wording is amended. We believe that the GMO-related wording could be improved or clearer. Again, warnings related to gaps in SPC. We would rather recommend neutral wording, sorry. And then we refer to all the other comments in the previous slides. So with this, I thank you for your attention and pleased to answer any questions or comments at the end of this meeting.
Okay, thank you very much, Frederick, for a very clear view on the industry position in terms of the immunological guidelines. So again, we will look to take questions at the end in the Q&A session. So we will move directly to the final presentation of this session. So this is the industry view reaction in terms of the two guidance documents that relate to the pharmaceuticals or chemical products. And here to present on this particular topic is Dr. Sandeep Gupta. Sandeep is a veterinarian with 20 years work experience in the pharmaceutical industry and clinical research and academia. And currently, Sandeep is head of clinical and new product development at Bimeda, based here in Dublin. And in that role, he's managing clinical trials globally and the introduction of new products to the R&D pipeline. So, Sandeep, I shall hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you to Ivo as well and your team for arranging this meeting. And thank you for providing this opportunity to AgVP for presenting industry view on safety and efficacy guidelines for limited markets. This presentation is a combined efforts from AgVP and Animal Health Europe, where a number of colleagues from industry, they have reviewed all these guidelines. However, as Rick previously said, due to the tight deadlines for the review, this presentation included very high-level comments and topics for discussion. Details comments are to be provided prior to the May deadline, David. Next slide, please. Now, industry welcome overall concept of limited market. It is a great opportunity which provide benefit to animal health consumers and also the marketing authorization holders. We did notice a gap which clearly identifying or outlining deviations from Annex 2 or Article 23 for the data requirements for limited markets. Sometimes it appears or can be perceived that most of the time there are identicalities in data requirement as of the full Annex 2 dossier. Therefore, it may be critical to elaborate processes which allowing deviation from full Annex 2 dossier. In comparison with the previous versions, recent guidelines are well explained, well written, and identifying the required sections clearly. Now, during the review by AgVP and Animal Health Europe, some issues are identified, and we will compile those and send to you prior to the May deadline. Now, what we noticed is that there's not much of the objective data reductions, exemptions, or omission of specific documentation in comparison with the current guidelines. We therefore request a tabulated overview of the differences would be highly appreciated. We also observed that there are requirements, however, these have been in the spirit of less limiting or less restrictive. These will be highlighted during our review. There are some minor typographical errors which we indicate during the review. Sometime when you go through the guidelines, it does not clearly indicate whether to stick to Annex 2 or use requirements from these guidelines or from the scientific advice. what we noticed that we do welcome approaching authority to seek guidance for data requirements. However, it appears all the emphasis on the scientific advice for limited markets. It also appears without the scientific advice, there's no provision to proceed with the application. Like industry, or as previously highlighted by yourself and Rick as well, David, means we understand the importance of scientific advice sometime, and however, it is a technically demanding, it is a significant expensive, and there are time-consuming follow-ups. So therefore, the request would be here that can there be an alternate approach as a binding to prepare the dossier if scientific advice is not sought? So that's an open question for discussion. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the wording within the Article 23, as shown previously by a number of presenters, it does not indicate quality. Now, in addition, these guidelines appears to be written to provide for as much certainty in the data as possible when it comes to the safety and residues. But it appears that there's a lack of emphasis has been given to the efficacy guidelines. This is not to say that the provided efficacy data does not have to comply with the proposed guidelines. Now, for example, this question is, can these guidelines somehow facilitate the use of the test product from R&D batch or the pilot batch, which are not in general representative of 10% or of the commercial batch, which are being required to be included in the data or to be used in the study. So if we have a greater clarification on that, that would be great. Now, these guidelines outline the following. For such application, the applicant shall submit parts 1 and 2 as described in Annex. Now, this does not highlight if or what deviations are expected, or if not, for the limited markets for Part 1 and Part 2. Next slide, please. Now, this slide highlights another important point that where industry would like to seek your assistance, adding a provision of GXP studies to the guidelines. The guidelines specify all types of studies, including data stemming from clinical trials conducted outside the Union. So if this is the case, studies conducted outside the Union in the spirit of GCP or GLP, which adhere to all standards, which include in-house laboratory standards or scientific or technical standard. So these should be allowed for Part 3 and 4 of the dossier, or should be considered. So means that last line of this slide does say that a proposal that the study is conducted in accordance with the GXP principle unless properly justified. So that's another open question for discussion, please. Next slide, please. Now, in relation to safety and residues guidelines, the guidelines suggest the use of endpoint-specific surrogate. I recall it was previously discussed with one of the presenters. We understand at the moment by reading these guidelines, there are no defined quality standards to accept surrogate. Guideline does provide a caution that the use of the surrogate may not be useful for hazard assessment. Now, guideline does provide a number of examples, but if we have a greater clarity, if data is not to be required from one of the examples provided within the guidelines, we would highly welcome if there is a tabulated information which indicate what surrogate in which situation, and what condition. So that will probably help to provide greater clarity in relation to the use of the surrogate and the endpoints. Next slide, please. Now, this is in relation to the maximum residue limits. We have certain questions which we will highlight up in our review and provide to you before the May deadline. But for this particular presentation, it is not clear if these guidelines intend to reduce data requirement for species if there is no MRL setup at all. Furthermore, it is also not clear how we intend to extrapolate metabolism data, ADME data, from laboratory species to mine species. I have an example here. If there is a clarity on using, say, for example, allometric scaling, etc., it would be welcomed. It is a suggestion from the industry. This is the last line, that if no marker residues are remaining following the metabolism, then is there any need to have the analytical method for the purpose? Next slide, please. This is in relation to efficacy and target element safety. The comments within this guidelines, which are almost similar to what we discussed previously on residues, which are specifically to add clearly defined endpoints for surrogate, definition of comparable or extrapolation of the data for metabolism. The industry is in the opinion it would be better to align various parts on preclinical, clinical, exploratory, and pilot studies in both guidelines. Currently, there's no definition of what does exploratory studies mean or pilot study means. So if there's a definition, it would be great. And also it would be, if at all possible, to clearly outline the geographical origin of the acceptable data. And also within this, the use of the R&D batches or the pilot batches for the studies, study purposes. That's it. Next slide. That conclude my presentation, David. And once again, I know some of it was a rehash, but previously discussed by various speakers. So I do apologize for that if there was a repeat. But again, thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, no need to apologize, and thank you very much for a very clear presentation outlining the industry initial reaction in relation to those specific guidance documents. So what I'm proposed to do now is that we'll open the Q&A session. I know that both Sandeep and Frederick had raised quite a number of issues in their presentation. But what I will do at this time, and all of those questions are noted, and as Eva said in the first session, we will look to take those into account in terms of subsequent work. But I would propose that we take some questions from the floor and then give Sandeep and Frederick an opportunity to consider, out of all the questions that they've raised, which they would like to put back to the members of the drafting group. So are there any questions from the floor? And as people are sort of lining up, I would just like to say that I'm quite conscious that we are very fast approaching our sort of 5 o'clock stop time. I was going to suggest that we may try and push to push our stop time until 5:15. So allow about 20 minutes or so for Q&A and then a 5-minute wrap up. So I would propose that we do that. So I would ask, are there any questions from the floor? Okay, I don't see anybody calling to the floor. Maybe Frederick, if I go to you, are there specific questions that you would like to discuss or have a view on now in the context of this Q&A? What question would you like an answer to?
Yes, so thank you again, David. So I think one of the key questions is to understand whether our proposal, for a smooth application of the guideline, after having answered the limited market eligibility itself, is palatable for the authorities at this stage. How do you see this, at least for vaccines?
Okay. Dr. Werner, do you have a particular view on that question?
I think that's a question that's very difficult to answer at this time. However, of course, we will try by training and so on to have a harmonized views of the assessors then on this point. And we had a long discussion in the drafting group on this guideline and what kind of requirements we can reduce. And there were experienced assessors in this group, so that I hope that we can really bring that to all assessors in the European Union for immunologicals and to find the right approach to go on with this kind of products. But I cannot totally answer your question with a clear yes now, but at least we will do our best on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Frederick, no definitive response, but a commitment to consider further. Do you have any other question that you would like to have addressed at this point?
Yeah, maybe a technical question. I mean, we noted that the guideline on immunologicals was referring to the association guideline. So we took the point that this was de facto allowing for companies to develop multivalent vaccines that would be considered for limited markets. However, we would like to avoid, by the simple reference to this guideline in the limited market guidance, that all the requirements for classical combined vaccines would apply to those products. So, and I don't know, again, I'm sure that this has been considered, but I would like to hear your views about, how this was viewed and how you plan to address this, maybe in a more comprehensive way in the next version of the guideline.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Werner, would you care to take that again?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I think it's known that it's a very challenging point. We are discussing for a long time, not only for this new limited market products, but also for classical marketing authorizations. And I must say we have not further discussed it in detail. Yeah, when we have prepared that, but taking into account your comment, of course, we will have further reflections on that to make it clear what is awaited here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. So another point that can be considered. I see that we have a number of people that are calling for the floor. So Dr. Holm, you were first up. So the secretary will unmute you in a minute, I think. Dr. Holm has disappeared. Dr. Sommer, Suzanne Sommer, you are next. And do you have a question for those that presented? Okay, I'm not hearing Suzanne either. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Elsa, can I give the floor to you? Do you have a question?
Hi, David. I don't have a question, in fact. I posted a question on the first session, but not now.
Okay, no, thanks.
Sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's okay. That's quite all right. Dr. Leshne, please.
Thank you, David. And I was typing a question, trying to ask a question. It's actually a question for those who work on the guidelines, because today, if we look at the MUMS guideline, it's not described in regulation. Still, we were able to have some reduction of requirements despite this absence in regulation. Now that we have a regulation consolidating or formalizing this approach, we see less flexibility. So my question is, why didn't you consider keeping quality reduction as part of the guideline, as we are doing today for MUMS? Because as we said, you may have some data coming from other products that are still valuable, and having the list that is currently in the table of the MUMS guideline will be helpful for that. If the guideline is only describing what is in regulation, to say it's only part 3 and 4, it will be a missed opportunity to give the incentive. Knowing that current guidelines for MUMS is having a very attractive part for the quality. If you remove this one, we are losing a lot of benefits because the safety and efficacy requirements are now kind of applicable to all vaccines. For example, efficacy trial, which was a way to reduce the cost for mumps vaccine, is now part of the classical vaccine. So with the flexibility given regulation and the approach you have, we don't see so much differences anymore between a limited market vaccine and a classical vaccine. So where the type of level of approach is not just only sticking to the regulation, but opening to opportunities, be considered and rule out for other reasons than just being compliant with the regulation.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Leslie. Dr. Berger, would you like to respond?
Yes, I can do that. Yes, the regulation is saying that there should be no deviations from regarding the quality part. And we had a discussion if we will leave in the requirements regarding the quality part, but finally it was agreed during the discussion also with CVMP that it will be taken out. I think it would be important to have also this comment from industry side that we can go back to this discussion and see what will be possible. But it's clearly mentioned in the regulation that this the quality part should be in line with the Annex 2. And from that point of view, we already tried to look at the part and the quality part in the Annex 2 if some reduction in requirements are possible, but I think there's not so much in it regarding limited market products itself, if it was not taken on board. However, we can have a further discussion on that after receiving all the comments from the public consultation. Thank you. In general, the opinion was there should be something included, but finally it was decided not to include it in this draft guidelines. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. And again, the specific reasoning for that is that the reduction in quality requirements is not provided for in that Article 23 provision. But you know, it is something that the CVMP can and would be prepared to reflect on within the context of what may be appropriate for limited markets, albeit maintaining Annex 2 compliance, which appears to be our reading, which is our reading of that particular provision. So again, the point is well made, and we look forward to receiving the written comment, and we will consider further and see what can be done. Okay, Sandeep, I didn't give you the opportunity to pose any particular question to the panel, so maybe if I go back to you now and see, is there a specific question or questions that you would like some clarity on just at this time?
Thank you, David. Yeah, there are a few questions, but the one which previously has been discussed and covered in relation to the scientific advice, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Can there be an alternate to the scientific advice? Or it appears so far that means you have to get the scientific advice in order to get the product for limited market over the line. Could there be a detail, say, for example, in a guidelines that this is what you need and there's a checklist or a tick box in order to get the product over the line? So just get the advice and opinion on that and thoughts on that.
Okay, no, I think that it is a fair question, and it is an issue, you know, it clearly has come up in all three presentations from the industry side, and it is something that we would need to reflect on further. And again, I wasn't personally involved in the drafting of the data requirements guidance, and maybe I may give an opportunity for those presenters to comment, but I'm not so sure that the intention was to make scientific advice obligatory or mandatory for these application types, other than suggesting that it may be an option or a tool that would be available to industry in order to get the predictability that they look for, or require, or expect in relation to how decisions may be taken in terms of eligibility. So I think it was intended as a helpful proposal,
Yes.
as distinct from a mandatory requirement. At least that's my understanding. But I do hear the comments from all the three presenters, and would suggest that maybe the wording around that does need to be reflected on further. Rick, in the original presentation, in his presentation, did make the point that if the applicants for this product type were to be forced down the scientific advice route, which, as I say, was not my understanding that was what was intended, that it would be appropriate or for consideration for incentives around that. So I think all of those points are well made and can be reflected on further.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, and any further comments or questions from your side, Sandeep, at this point?
Not, but we put them together and then later on and submit to you. So.
Okay, before the deadline. No, thank you for that. And I will take another question from the floor just now. Dr. Bruno, you wanted to pose a question?
Yes, thank you very much for the interesting presentation and exchange of ideas. I'm going back to a point discussed in the previous session about the future publication of guidelines for limited market products or indication that are not eligible in Article 23. Okay, we don't have a date, and it's understood that they won't be available in the next months. So the question is for the CVMP. In the hypothesis of a variation or to add a new claim, let's say for a very rare indication, very rare condition or an established product happening in the near future, let's say in 2022. And in this scenario, we will be not eligible for Article 23 because of the current provisions. And at the same time, there are no guidelines available yet for this type of products. In such a scenario, would it be acceptable for the CVMP if the applicant refers to the principle established in the old MAMS guidelines, even if they are repealed, not applicable anymore?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and you know, I can't give you a definitive answer on it other than to say that in the particular scenario that you outline, I would hope that the CVMP wouldn't be so inflexible as to forget the data requirements that are currently being applied to limited market products. That's not a very direct answer to your question, but I think it would be, as I say, I think that those guidance documents, while they may not be officially applicable, I don't think that they would be that easily forgotten about. Is that an answer for you, Dr. Bruno?
That is a very good answer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we have, Dr. Leshny, I see your hand is up. Is that sort of an old hand, as we say?
Yeah, that's why my first on quality, but I can take just for a question on GMO, because when Esther presented GMO and the fact that we have to be full annex, it's full annex of 2118, not full annex on the new regulation. So the way it is worded is quite negative for GMO, which also has already sometime a negative. perception with the citizens. That's why what we said as being less negative. The full annex of 2118 should be fulfilled, but still we can have reduction for the annex with the medicinal product. And you can raise, change my raise. Okay, I just changed my hands now.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Dr. Werner, have you any immediate response to that comment?
What I already said during my presentation, I think we will also have a look on this paragraph we have in the guideline now, if there is and to update and bring it in line with the right wording, and have a look to make it really clear what is requested there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, I don't see anybody else calling for the floor, so I will take it that there are no sort of other immediate pressing questions that people have at this time. And you know, as has been said by both Dr. Gupta and Dr. Decomp, the industry stakeholders at least will be providing further detailed written comment in advance of the deadline for this consultation, and the comments made during the course of this focus group meeting, and clearly the written comments will be very useful to the CVMP in terms of finalising this particular approach. So, you know, for all those stakeholders that are still on the line, I would just encourage you, please do provide us with written comments, because these are an important guideline set for us. And, you know, we want to do what we can do within the parameters of the legislation to make the situation in terms of availability better. So just to add that as a message. Given that there are no other persons calling for the floor.
David, I see Kat Sterling still has a question. I'm not sure whether she wants to take the floor or she's put it in writing. So.
Okay, sorry, I missed that. Dr. Sterling, would you like to ask?
It was a comment as much as a question, David, in the context of the quality data reductions. So we understand where we stand legally. I just wonder, when I think about it and hear you discussing it, whether, because for industry, as Frederick already alluded to, the data reductions or the flexibility in Annex 2 is probably a better way to put it, that we've had under mums, has made a big difference, particularly for immunologicals. And I wonder whether in that context, it's viable for us to continue to be able to have some of that flexibility clearly laid out in the context of this. So while we accept we can't have data gaps as per Article 23, if we're still able to benefit from some of that flexibility in Annex 2 in the context of limited markets when it comes to quality, I think that would be beneficial. And I wondered whether it would help for industry to give you a clear idea of which aspects of that make a big difference in terms of development of mum/limited market products.
Absolutely, Kat. That is, you know, we are open to any proposals or suggestions in terms of, you know, how you would wish to see data requirements applied to limited market products. But just to be absolutely clear, and you know, as said by Esther and repeated by myself, you know, within the context of data requirements guidance for products considered eligible for Article 23, the provision itself does not see data reductions in terms of quality requirements. So, you know, it would be a case of exploring what flexibility is there within Annex 2 and how that can be exploited, if that's the correct term. And if you have proposals in respect to that, well, then by all means, we look forward to receiving them. I see Dr. Burke.
Yeah, it's maybe something to follow up on. It's just when thinking about it, as I sort of think through what you're saying, you know, there, as you say, there's no formal legal base for data reductions, but at the same time, as you outline in the paper, you essentially consider that most products that are currently now mums would comply with Annex 2. Therefore, it's more a case of areas where we can have some more flexibility on what data we provide at the submission and things where we may well generate that data over time. So I think it's maybe something to reflect on for both sides.
Okay, no, that's fine. That point is well made. And again, even in terms of the safety and efficacy requirements, if there are specific proposals around those, well then, by all means, we're all ears. In terms of what was presented on the pharmaceutical specifically, it's clear from the presentation that Dr. Scheid gave that from our side, from the regulator side, that we will continue to look for certain assurances in respect of safety, be that for the user, for the consumer, or for the environment. It's just the flexibility in approach to how you get there. But essentially, the assurances in respect to safety would be needed, and that's sort of something that's reflected in the guidance document. In terms of the efficacy and target animal safety requirements, the big shift, as you will all appreciate, I would imagine, is from proof of efficacy to reasonable expectation of, and which would appear to me to be a significant shift when you consider the types of limited market applications that have been considered over the last 10 years by CVMP, in terms of where those were either withdrawn or rejected by the committee, and this is all publicly available information. In the majority of those cases, it was around challenges or difficulties in terms of proving efficacy of the product. So, that is a fairly significant shift. But again, we look forward to seeing written comments from industry and all other stakeholders on those specific points. Okay. We are 11 minutes over, and maybe, Ivo, are there any concluding remarks from the side of the Secretariat, or is there any sort of overview from the side of the Secretariat before we formally bring the session to a close?
Well, David, a few slides have been prepared trying to summarize the discussions, but in the interest of time, I think we will not bring them onto the screen. It is in order to avoid that another discussion starts. As you said, we're 11 minutes over time. Propose that we try and finalize the meeting here, if that's okay with you.
Okay, no, that's fine.
The wrap-up will be that to thank everyone for the contribution today. I think there were some very good discussions. In that sense, this focus group meeting has, I think, met its objective of informing the stakeholders, but also providing the opportunity to stakeholders to ask for clarification. So I would first and foremost like to thank the presenters, industry, and the chairs of the working parties, and the chair of CVMP, obviously, for their respective contributions to today's meeting. But I would also like to thank people that have been involved directly in the drafting of the guidance documents. And I wouldn't normally do this, but now that I have the floor, I take the opportunity to thank my own staff, specifically Susanna Thiele, Anna Viccellio, Alejandro Paz Orzaes, Sebastian Giro, Valentin Nicorescu, Noemi Garcia, and Alberto Contreras for the hard work that they have put into this, obviously in close collaboration with CVMP members and the chairs in drafting the guidance. It's been an awful lot of work. I didn't do the calculation, but I feel that articles 23 and 24 probably together are maximum of 500 words. And I think we've translated that into approximately 30,000 words of guidance. So that shows that the guidance you need to explain what is really meant in the regulation is an awful lot more than what you expect. I hope we can still simplify it to a large extent. I also expressed the hope here that the limited markets guidance that we put out and the new regulation will indeed actively lead to A, simplification, and B, increased availability of veterinary medicinal products on the market. It's not going to be an easy task given the discussions today. but one can always hope, David. And with that, I give it back to you and allow you the honor of formally closing this meeting.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivo. Yeah, just to echo the thanks to all the presenters today, in particular to those that were presenting the perspective from industry. So to Rick, to Frederick, and to Sandy, thank you very much for your thoughts on those guidance documents. We do very much look forward to receiving written comments that can assist us in terms of finalising these. The reflection paper and the associated guidance documents from industry, but also from all other or any other stakeholders that are interested in this particular provision, Article 23 and 24. And again, it is a priority area for us, and we are approaching this work in an attempt to sort of make the situation better. So that is our overall objective. So again, thank you to the presenters. Thank you to everybody at the agency behind the who has worked to put this event together. And last but not least, thank you to everybody else that has joined us today for this session. And with that, I will formally close, and I wish you all a very good day.